about some interesting insights and alternative investment thesis that emerge from taking a critical look beyond the hype of India's digital startup ecosystem. Although the headlines talk about nearly 25 to 30 billion dollars having been invested in India's digital startups in the last 4 or 5 years, but if you take a closer look at Exhibit 1 and take a deeper look, what you realize is that the lion's share has actually gone to late stage or growth stage plays, and that to a select few, fewer than half a dozen players have creamed up the bulk of that share. And the true early stage risk capital pool, which is the yellow bars in that Exhibit 1, is very, very small at barely less than about $300 million on an annual basis, which is clearly far too small a pool of risk capital for early stage, and clearly a lot more needs to be done to boost that. Although the headlines again and the hype focuses on the valuations of these so-called digital unicorns, but not enough attention is paid to the huge amounts of capital that these plays also consume. And when you compare the two ratios of capital invested to market value, then you find that actually the overall multiplier for the investors is fairly low and indeed rather questionable. Take for example Flipkart. Even though the headlines focus on its $20 billion valuation as per Walmart's recent acquisition of it, but if you adjust for the $2 billion of cash on its books and factor in that even despite that about $6 billion of invested capital has already been invested in that venture, then that invested capital to market value ratio is only barely about 3x. Which is very, very low considering the risk as well as the reasonably long 7, 8, 10 years that it's been on this journey. And relative to the Facebooks and other US and Chinese tech titans such as Apple, etc., those players for a similar cash adjusted market value to book value multiple would be more like 6 to 10x. So clearly the investor returns are relatively low and questionable. And need further focus on capital, getting more bang for buck out of the capital. The third issue is that these digital startups don't produce much in the name of jobs. In the Indian context, barely about 100,000 jobs have been created in this digital startup ecosystem, which is fairly low bang for buck given the 25 to 30 billion dollars of investment. And at one level, that's not an unusual outcome. Indeed, all over the world, digital startups and digital players are not very high in employment creating numbers. But the bigger issue from macroeconomic policy planners' perspective in the Indian context is that given the Indian demographics need almost 10 million jobs on an annual basis to be new jobs to be created, then the digital plays are not really going to make much of a dent in that area, which then begs the issue of what are alternative entrepreneurial ecosystems that we should consider that would give job creation of the required magnitude. And in this regard, I think we need to think more creatively and look at interesting combinations that create rural livelihoods at large scale. For example, can we dream up interesting combinations such as a Patanjali or a Khadi Gram Udyog using its rural and cooperative upstream supply chains and linking that to market access through a Craftsvilla or an Etsy types of combinations, and similarly food cooperatives and Ayurvedic personal care cooperatives and sustainable housing sourcing that is linked to the big bazaars and big basket type combinations.